Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. The topic of this top 10, top 10 wrestlers who deserved a WrestleMania moment. Now, as you may notice, a lot of these wrestlers on this list have either wrestled on WrestleMania or multiple WrestleManias, but never really had that standout, triumphant, or even in losing great WrestleMania moments. None of these wrestlers have had the Mike Tyson holding your arm up at the end of WrestleMania 14 like Stone Cold, or the ladder match at WrestleMania 10 with Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels, or Hogan vs. Andre, or Hogan vs. The Warrior, or any litany of other great moments in WrestleMania history. But I definitely think the people on this list deserve to have one of those. And I will say there is one caveat. I didn't include people that were retired before WrestleMania or that are still kind of in their prime of their careers, because technically a guy like Kenny Omega, who's never had a great WrestleMania moment, he could be in one of the next 3 or 4 WrestleManias and have that. So that's why I didn't include any of the newer generation that's still currently active and near the prime of their careers. And I also didn't include people like Buddy Rogers or Bruno Sammartino, who their highlights of their careers happened well before WrestleMania started and were already pretty much out of wrestling by the time WrestleMania was a thing. With all that being said, let's jump right into it. Starting off at number 10, the magnificent Don Morocco. When people talk about the history of the WWE, or at the time WWF, and the early transition from Vince Sr. to Vince Jr., they bring up people like Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper, who are definitely deserving, and others like Savage, Andre the Giant. But a lot of times, one of the guys that gets left off of the list that people don't really bring up that helped that transition, that helped get the WWE or WWF off the ground and into Vince's vision for it, was Morocco. Morocco was a guy that was so solid and such a great heel that he made the baby faces he wrestled better, whether it be Tito Santana, whether it be Jimmy Superfly Snuka, Hulk Hogan. He had a great run with Hulk Hogan, which should have been used more and could have easily been a WrestleMania main event. No knock on King Kong Bundy, but I would have rather have seen at WrestleMania 2 Morocco versus Hogan for the championship. I think it would have been a way more interesting match than what we got. I would have settled on one of the early WrestleManias having Morocco just be in a high profile match. He doesn't seem to have ever got that opportunity to be in a high profile match on what most people consider the biggest stage of them all. He's a guy that I think, in my opinion, is criminally underrated. I absolutely love Morocco. I love his work, which is why I considered him for this list. Now, going from Morocco, our number 9, the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Now, I could easily put both the Bulldogs on here, and if you really think about it, if you think back, where are all your great British Bulldog memories? They're not from WrestleMania. They're from other shows, other matches, other pay-per-views. For a guy that was so popular and so important from the mid-80s all the way to the end of the 90s, to not have that standalone WrestleMania moment, to not have that big triumphant moment, and I'm not saying it had to be a main event. None of these have to be a main event. There's some matches that transcend that, like Savage and Steamboat. That transcends a WrestleMania main event. People still look very fondly back on that. Bulldog definitely deserved his Savage Steamboat moment. He deserved even to be in the consideration to be a main event and be a world champion at WrestleMania. What an amazing wrestler, and a guy that a whole generation, my generation, grew up loving the British Bulldog. He was one of the most idolized wrestlers of that time. Now, going from that, our number 8, the People's Champion, Diamond Dallas Page. And yes, I know that was a little bit triggering because some people consider The Rock the People's Champion, even though they both use the moniker. Much like Morocco, who was The Rock Don Morocco first, DDP started calling himself the People's Champion before The Rock did. And a lot of people will look back at this, and this is one of those things that people point to where WWE did not do enough with the WCW talent that came over, DDP being one of the biggest examples of that. Here you have a guy that spent the better part of 5 years being a main eventer in WCW, and he's brought into WWE and pretty much from the beginning treated as a joke. It's things like this that really made you realize how WWE thought of the WCW talent and how petty someone like Vince McMahon could be at times, in the fact that he wouldn't even have considered DDP to be one of his top talents, even though he was a guy that the fans loved, that they got behind, and he could have brought some of those WCW fans that stopped watching over to WWE. In my opinion, one of the real icons of the late 90s era of wrestling, Diamond Dallas Page definitely deserved to get that spot. He definitely deserved to have a high-profile match on WrestleMania and get his WrestleMania moment. We'll go from that, our number 7. A guy that spent a lot of years in WWE and wrestled on several WrestleMania cards, but never really had the WrestleMania moment that he deserved. Ron Simmons, aka Farouk. I just mentioned how little was done with DDP. The same story could go for Farouk. Farouk, in my opinion, is easily one of the biggest missed opportunities in wrestling history. You could have built Ron Simmons, Farouk up to be a challenger for The Rock or Steve Austin, or even as we go on a little bit longer, he could have been a challenge for a young John Cena, a young Randy Orton, a grizzled veteran who they'd have to overcome. He was such a great wrestler and such a great talker that it's so weird that WWE never did more than they did with him, because he was so great at everything and his build was organic. The fans just loved Farouk and loved to cheer for him. He would have made an absolute perfect opponent for, let's say, the Intercontinental Championship in WrestleMania 13, or even as we go on, you could have built him to have a great match with, say, someone like The Undertaker at WrestleMania 16 or 17. I think that Farouk, in my opinion, is one of those guys that is drastically underrated and definitely deserved more than he got. Now, going from Farouk, our number 6. The whole effing show, Mr. Monday Night, Rob Van Dam. Much like I said with Diamond Dallas Page, Rob Van Dam came from ECW, and it felt like he was always fighting an uphill battle in WWE. He was easily one of the most popular wrestlers in the company, but he would get stuck in hardcore battle royals, multi-man ladder matches, and never really had that opportunity to be a big star at WrestleMania. Now, some of that is squarely on the shoulders of RVD. When he was given the ball at One Night Stand, he ended up getting arrested shortly thereafter. So when he finally got the chance to run with the ball, he dropped it. So there is a little bit of that that's on Rob Van Dam, but it's not like WWE didn't give other wrestlers multiple opportunities. Guys like Randy Orton and Jeff Hardy come to example. And not knocking these guys at all. I am not in any way disparaging them. I'm just making a point to say they've had similar transgressions without the backlash. Rob Van Dam was absolutely a guy that all the fans loved. All the guys wanted to see do better. Everyone wanted to see him as a world champion. And he really deserved to have that really great moment. Could you imagine a Rob Van Dam, Kurt Angle match at WrestleMania, or a Rob Van Dam Triple H match for the championship at WrestleMania? How great they would be. A guy like Edge versus Rob Van Dam. The possibilities of it are endless. And I think it's an absolute shame that they never pulled the trigger on him. Much like everybody else I've mentioned so far, absolutely deserving, never quite got the opportunity. Now, going from that, our number 5. And it's perfect because he's a five-time WCW champion, Booker T. Everybody looks back at WrestleMania 19 and everybody points to the fact that the wrong wrestler went over. And I'm a Triple H guy. I love Triple H. He's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. But they're absolutely right. This build-up, this match was made for Booker T to win. He should have came out of that as the world champion, unquestioned, the conquering hero, the guy that overcame the odds, the guy that overcame, and let's be honest, during that build-up, there was a lot of questionable stuff said by Triple H. The guy that overcame that overcame diversity, that overcame adversity, the guy that did it, the guy that wasn't supposed to be a WWE superstar became a WWE superstar, and on the biggest stage got to show off why he was that guy. Again, a lot of people point to this as one of the biggest missed opportunities in WWE history. I definitely agree with that. I think Booker T really deserved to win that match, and even if not that match, he deserved to have his WrestleMania moment where the confetti's falling from the roof, where he's standing crying in the ring. Awesome wrestler, one of the great wrestlers of his generation. Definitely deserved it in my opinion. Now going from that, our number 4. You're going to start noticing a little bit of a pattern here, where a lot of these wrestlers made their name outside of WWE, and then when coming into WWE, they were made to feel less important. And no one on this list exemplifies that more than this next guy, Big Van Vader. Vader is an absolute legend, whether you talk about his work in Germany, his work in Japan, his work in WCW, all over the world. This guy is revered as one of the great wrestlers of all time. One of the best big men to ever do it. One of the most believable big men to ever do it. A guy that you would think would have perfect matches with Undertaker or Steve Austin or Bret Hart or even Shawn Michaels, which we'll get there, we know was part of the problem as to why he wasn't pushed further. I absolutely think with 100% certainty that Big Van Vader was one of those guys that WWE not only dropped the ball with, they dropped the ball, put a hole in the ball, ripped it into a million pieces, set it on fire, and never could put it back together because they so damaged the image of Big Van Vader that there was no reclamation for him. Could you imagine a world where one of the obstacles of the greatness of The Rock, the greatness of Stone Cold, heck, even for a guy like Ken Shamrock, one of the obstacles on his Intercontinental run was Big Van Vader, and they had to have a showdown at WrestleMania, and maybe a street fight. Maybe one of Mick Foley's WrestleMania moments could have been Cactus Jack versus Big Van Vader with all the backstory behind it. Again, like a lot of these people on this list, it feels like he was more punished for being a star outside of WWE than he was rewarded for being one of the great wrestlers of his time. Another huge missed opportunity in my opinion. That's why he makes our list. I'll go from that, our number 3, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. At the time I'm recording this video, we're just a couple weeks off from what is pretty obvious to most people, Dusty Rhodes' son, Cody Rhodes, triumphantly winning the championship at WrestleMania. But we gotta dial it back to when Dusty was in the company. And a lot of people point to the polka dots and think of how silly that was. I don't think it was necessarily polka dots. I think Dusty made those polka dots fun. As a Dusty Rhodes fan at the time, I had loved watching him in Jim Crockett, and when he came over to WWE and they put the polka dots, I never really seen it as a bad thing. And I think a lot of the people that were watching, the younger kids who the show was geared to at the time, they also didn't see it as a bad thing. They just seen Dusty Rhodes, this ultra charismatic, one-of-a-kind talent that never could be duplicated in WrestleMania history or wrestling history. I think Dusty definitely deserved to have that moment. Now, it may not have been the WWE Championship match, but maybe a Dusty Rhodes vs. Honky Tonk Man match on the biggest stage, a Dusty vs. DiBiase match where there's much more on the line. We did get what I would consider, out of everybody on this list, probably the most high-profile match, with him and Sapphire going up against Savage and Sensational Sherry. But I think that was more for what happened with Savage and Sherry than anything about Dusty Rhodes. Dusty didn't get to have his moment. That was Savage's moment. So in my opinion, for one of the all-time greats, easily in my top 10 wrestlers of all time, he definitely deserved to have a WrestleMania moment. I'll go from that to our number 2. Another guy that's in my top 10 wrestlers of all time, the hardcore icon, Terry Funk. When people ask me who I think the greatest wrestler of all time, I always tell them it's two people. It's Ric Flair and it's Terry Funk. They're 1A and 1B. Terry Funk, in my opinion, is the epitome of pro wrestling. He's believable. He could be violent when he needs to. He could slow it down and have a mat-based match with the best of them. He's the absolute perfect example of what a professional wrestler should be. You believed him as a violent heel. You loved him as a over-the-hill babyface, and he could have been perfect at any time during the WrestleMania history. There was rumored that they were going to try and do a death match, an exploding ring death match at WrestleMania 14, that didn't go through, but that would have been absolutely perfect. What a way to put a cap on a legendary career, which I know he wrestled after that, but that would have put a nice feather in the cap of Terry Funk. Let him and Mick Foley show you why they're considered two of the great hardcore wrestlers of all time. Put on a crazy, insane match for everyone to see that I guarantee people would still be talking to this day. It just feels like we were slighted getting Terry Funk in one of those great roles. Imagine this, and it's just a crazy idea, but imagine Terry Funk helping during the build-up of the Ultimate Warrior, being an Ultimate Warrior WrestleMania opponent. With the way that guys like Hogan and Savage could get a great match out of Warrior, you don't think that Terry Funk could have done that too? Imagine if he was used in that capacity. I mean, just an all-time great that should have been used for something at some point. Didn't quite get his opportunity. That's why he's number 2 on my list. Now, before we get to our number 1, I do a thing here with my top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, it's people that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Tito Santana. Tito got to wrestle on a number of WrestleMania cards and a lot of the biggest drawing WrestleManias of all time, but he never had that signature Tito Santana winning against all odds mode. For a guy who had legendary feuds against Greg Valentine, Don Morocco, Randy Savage, and all others during this time frame, we really should have had at least one Tito Santana match that we look back on like Savage and Steamboat. Now, I'm not saying that we should have had Santana versus Hogan at any point, but what if we had like a 20-minute match of Santana and Savage, or Santana and Bob Orton, or Santana and Paul Orndorff, or they got to show how great they were in the ring. Just one of those guys that, in my opinion, much like I said with Morocco, helped build the company, but kind of gets forgotten on how important that they were, and having that WrestleMania moment would have really meant something to their legacy. Now, last but not least on the best of the rest, Wade Barrett. Unlike every other wrestler on this list, and he may get in there sometime, Wade Barrett's not an obvious wrestling Hall of Famer, but I think a lot of the reasoning is he wasn't given the opportunity. Coming out of the Nexus, coming out of that original NXT run, even going into his bad news gimmick, Wade Barrett was a guy that had so much untapped potential and could have been so much more than he was. He could have easily been one of the great heels of his generation. He never really got that opportunity, and it's really a shame because I think Barrett really deserved it, and we as fans deserve to see Wade Barrett do much more than he did. I think he really should have got that chance, and I would have loved to see an alternate timeline where we look back and maybe Wade Barrett takes the roles that Alberto Del Rio had. Just my opinion on a guy that really should have been more than he was and really never got pushed the way he should have. Now, before I get to my number 1, if you think I left someone off the list, put a wrestler too high, put a wrestler too low, let me know down here in the comments. While you're there, smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. And our number 1 wrestler that deserved to have a WrestleMania moment, Jerry the King Lawler. For the better part of 30 years, Jerry Lawler has worked with the WWE. He's been part of their most iconic announce team. He's had notable feuds in the company, but he's only had one WrestleMania match, and that match was against Michael Cole. Much like I talked about with Don Morocco, there are a lot of wrestling fans that do not know how great Jerry the King Lawler really was, because they may have seen the feud with Bret Hart, they may have seen the feud with Jake the Snake Roberts that he did, but they didn't see any of his Memphis stuff. They only remember him as the guy who was the comedy on the JR and Jerry the King Lawler team. They remember him as a guy that went nuts anytime that a girl would come out that was beautiful and would scream puppies and say all kinds of inappropriate things. Jerry was definitely one of the great announcers that's ever been. There is no denying that, but he was also one of the great wrestlers of all time. And the real shame is that he never got to show that part of himself at WrestleMania. Especially when you look back at some of the lean years, the 95, 96. You're telling me we couldn't have had a Jerry the King Lawler match on those cards? You know, maybe you could have seen something like Lawler versus Razor Ramon, or Lawler versus the British Bulldog. There's a great match that never happened. It could have. Lawler against a young Mick Foley. Or even as we go on into the Attitude Era, we could have had, which we've seen several times they use this, someone come over and maybe attack Jim Ross, and now Jerry the King Lawler has to stand up for Jim Ross. It would have been absolutely perfect and absolutely fitting for one of the greats of all time to get to show that on the main stage on WrestleMania. It's such a shame for a guy that worked for the company for so long and gave us such memorable moments, didn't get to have that WrestleMania moment that he so rightfully deserved. With all that being said, if you made it to the end of this video, let me know what you think. Who do you think is one wrestler that deserved a WrestleMania moment that didn't quite get it? Let me know down here in the comments. My name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.